the 228 massacre. The 228 massacre occurred on occupied Japanese territory. That made it a war crime that there's never been a tribunal for, a war crime where the war criminals have never been brought to justice. The Chinese nationalists in Taiwan said, we have a revolt going on. The Taiwanese people are rising up against us. We need more soldiers. And Chiang Kai-shek just sent over thousands of troops. They arrived on March 9th of 1947, and the killing and the bloodshed began immediately. As the Chinese troop ships arrived to the coast in the harbor there outside Taipei, they began shooting the ducks before they even got to shore. And as soon as they landed, they drove trucks down the streets, just machine gunning the buildings. A wave of terror. On March 9th, hundreds of people were rounded up and executed. People that had been identified as troublesome. The doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the civic leaders. Thousands more were gunned down in the streets simply because they were there when the machine guns were firing. More war crimes that also have gone unpunished. An American naval officer who was assigned to the council, George Kerr, sent daily messages to Washington about the terror that was going on, asking for help that never came. On March 12th, 3 days after the Chinese troops arrived and began the murder, President Harry Truman issued the Truman Doctrine. There were problems in post-war Europe, particularly in Greece and in Turkey. And so Truman said, well, we can't let bad things happen to the Greeks and the Turks. And he announced the Truman Doctrine. Here's what President Truman said about Europe while the killing is going on in Taiwan. Totalitarian regimes imposed on free people by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and endanger the security of the United States. Well, wasn't that what was happening in Taiwan? Why does the Truman Doctrine only apply in Europe and not in Taiwan? Truman went on. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Well, that is what was happening in Taiwan. So the Truman Doctrine only applied in Europe and not in Taiwan, a double standard. Shame on Harry Truman. I used to be kind of fond of Harry Truman. He was one of my favorite presidents, but after I've learned what happened, I've lost any respect. And he was also the president who made the phrase, the buck stops here. He's the one that makes the decisions. Well, the buck stops there, Mr. President. Harry Truman, you're responsible for what happened in Taiwan. You sent the troops there, you were informed by George Kerr what was happening, and you did nothing. Finally, the reports coming from the American Council built up so much that on April 21st of 1947, the American ambassador, Walton Butterworth, sent a memo to Chiang Kai-shek, a thick memo, detailing the eyewitness reports of the tragedy and the torture and the murder that had been gathered from Americans, Canadians, and British that were in Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek said, well, I'll read the memo. This is not what I'm hearing from my troops on the ground. And nothing happened. I don't know if Chiang Kai-shek read the memo or not, but the Americans did nothing other than give the report to him. March 14th, 1949. Now America's spy agency is into the picture, the Central Intelligence Agency. And on March 14th, 1949, months before the exiled government would come to the island with 2 million more Chinese nationalists, the CIA wrote a report to President Truman titled Possible Developments in Taiwan, and they stamped it secret. And it remained a secret document for years and years and years. Finally, it was declassified. And here's what that secret CIA memo to President Truman said. The native population of Taiwan would welcome release from Chinese control, but it is not now strong enough to stage a successful revolt. In other words, the oppression is so strong, the people cannot revolt. What are we supposed to do? The CIA report went on. There is strong sentiment in Taiwan favoring independence, but the situation is complicated by the conflicting interests of the native Taiwanese and the Chinese nationalist elements. The Taiwanese bitterly resent the performance of the nationalist administration. The Chinese rulers have exploited the native population to the limit without regard for their welfare. This is what the CIA was telling President Truman. United States support to the Taiwanese aspirations would require taking over authority from the established nationalist regime. So once again, nothing happened. The White Terror period continued. The Americans knew about it, and they did nothing but put a secret stamp on it to keep it quiet. Finally, people in the State Department who had read the reports and were shocked at President Truman's inaction began plotting an overthrow of Chiang Kai-shek. Between March and July of 1949, the Department of State, George Kennan and Dean Acheson, plotted an overthrow of Chiang Kai-shek. George Kennan said, "We've got to make it look like a spontaneous independence movement in Formosa." Dean Acheson assigned a diplomat to continue the plotting of the overthrow, a man named Livingston Marchant. And he was assigned to implement the overthrow of Chiang Kai-shek. He studied the situation, and he decided that there was a particular general, ROC general, that was the best candidate to replace Chiang Kai-shek, General Sun Lee-jin. The Americans made arrangements for General Sun to travel to Tokyo and meet with Douglas MacArthur, who would raise the issue of a coup d'etat. General Sun did go to Tokyo and meet with MacArthur. MacArthur told him, "If you overthrow Chiang Kai-shek, we will support you." But General Sun was loyal to the ROC and instead went back to Taiwan and reported to Chiang Kai-shek, "The Americans want to overthrow you." The next month, August 1949, the CIA bought the Civil Air Transport. The Civil Air Transport was a company that was developed during World War II to help supplement the war against the Japanese in China. And at this point, they had a fleet of airplanes. The CIA bought it, and in August 49, it was the largest airline in Taiwan, run by the American Central Intelligence Agency. In October 10th of 1949, the CIA began their secret missions flying into China for spy missions. November 3rd, 1949. Reports continued to come out of Taiwan about the horror of the White Terror period. And so the American Consul General gave yet